The twin sons of Zalara bled fire into the sky, casting long, bruised shadows across the Colosseum carved into the mountain's rib. Thunderous cries echoed through the jagged arena, voices thick with anticipation and bloodlust. The atmosphere sizzled with heat and fury. Today, a human warrior would stand alone against a champion of the Krellorian Empire. A spectacle, a test, a mockery. Captain James Corvin stood in the center of the ring, his boots sinking slightly into the scorched sand, the fine dust clinging to the sweat lining his jaw. The acrid scent of heat-treated metal, alien sweat, and old blood filled the air. He had removed his Federation-issued armor earlier, too stiff, too foreign for the kinetic dance that would soon unfold. Instead, he wore the loose-fitting, dark-grain training garb issued by the Krellorian hosts, the fabric unfamiliar, the stitching tight against his chest. He wasn't here to fight, not originally. He had come to Zalara to negotiate peace between Earth's fledgling outer colonies and the Krellorian Empire, a reptilian warrior race known for their strict codes of battle and dominance. James had been chosen for his discipline, his restraint, and ironically, his ability to not provoke. But peace talks had taken a turn. The Krellorian delegates, insulted by what they perceived as weakness in the human approach to diplomacy, had invoked the trial of proven steel, a barbaric rite in which honor was settled through open combat. No weapons, no tech, no translators, just the ring, the blood, and the victor. James had accepted, not because he believed in this savage ritual, but because refusing would have meant forfeiting the lives of the human settlers waiting in orbit, caught in a political vice. Now the arena roared as his opponent stepped forward. She was magnificent, Aricia of the Iron Scales, first daughter of the Storm Trident, champion of 81 duels, slayer of 12 species, and inheritor of the Emerald Crest. She stood over 7 feet tall, her obsidian-hued scales glinting like armor beneath the sunlight, each step she took a quake beneath her. Her eyes, golden and slitted, scanned the arena not with excitement, but with disgust. She stopped before him, looming like a monolith of flesh and pride. The crowd quieted. "You stink of fear and mammal's sweat," she hissed, her accent thick but fluent. "This is your idea of honor?" He didn't flinch. Aricia leaned forward. Her breath was hot with spice and venom. "Slave," she spat, her voice low, deliberate, brutal. Then with serpentine precision she drew back and spat directly into his face. The spittle hit him across the cheekbone, hot, laced with chemical burn and sizzling as it touched his skin. The entire Colosseum erupted in wild screams of approval. James stood there, his expression unchanged. He reached up, wiped the spit from his cheek with 2 fingers, then rubbed them together calmly. His eyes never left hers. Something dangerous lit within him. Not rage, not humiliation. Something older. Something he had buried a long time ago beneath orders and peace treaties. A part of him that had once crawled out of the jungles of Centauri Prime with a shattered arm and 2 broken ribs dragging 6 civilians across enemy lines. "You've made your mistake," he said softly, more to himself than to her. Aricia grinned, baring rows of fangs. And somewhere deep in the crowd, the starting gong began to rise, preparing to sound. The gong struck, a deep, bone-shaking boom that silenced even the rowdiest of the Krellorian spectators. Dust trembled. The tension in the air snapped like a taut wire cut mid-string. Aricia moved first, a blur of black and silver, closing the gap between them with terrifying grace for someone of her size. Her claws gleamed under the sun's, her muscles coiled with years of training. A victory. James didn't move, not yet. Her first strike came fast. A sweeping left aimed for his ribs, claws extended, intended to draw blood immediately. It was the move she used to bait her opponents, to throw them off balance, to start the dance on her terms. But he didn't play. He pivoted sideways, light as breath, his right arm snaking around her striking forearm, his body twisting with perfect timing. Then came the first sound, crack. Her wrist, fractured by his grip, bent backward at an unnatural angle. Aricia let out a sharp, choked grunt of pain. She swung her right claw toward his throat, wild now. Faster. Desperate. Too late. He ducked under it and drove his elbow up into her jaw. Crack again, dislocating the joint cleanly. She staggered, eyes wide, limbs uncoordinated. That was 3 seconds. The 4th came as he stepped behind her, hooked his leg into hers, and drove his palm into the center of her back, slamming her face first into the ground with a force that sent a shockwave through the sand. Her breath left her in a hoarse hiss, her limbs limp, her pride fractured like her jaw. The 5th second was the silence. The audience had not yet processed what they'd seen. Aricia lay face down in the dirt. James stood over her, calm, not gloating, just finished. Then the sound returned. First gasps, then murmurs, then cries of disbelief. The Krylorian crowd erupted not in anger, but in shock. Their indomitable champion, defeated in 5 seconds by a human who had been called slave. James turned slowly, scanning the crowd. His voice rose, not in defiance, but in cool, cutting clarity. Now you'll remember who came here for peace, and who spat on it. Then he walked from the arena, leaving behind the dust, the blood, and the silence of a world that had just witnessed something they never thought possible. A human, not begging for mercy, but commanding respect. Aricia awoke with the bitter taste of blood between her fangs and the taste of shame across her tongue. Her body ached, wrist splintered, jaw tightly bandaged, ribs bruised. But it wasn't the pain that hollowed her chest. It was the silence. Not the silence in the medic chamber, where physicians hovered and healers whispered behind closed lips. No, this was the silence of a fallen name, of spectators who had once chanted Aricia the Invincible, now whispering her defeat like a blasphemy. She could not speak, not yet. Her jaw was reset, but not ready to bear the weight of language. Not that she needed words to understand what had been taken from her. The Arena Council had already sent word. A public statement was being drafted. Her defeat would not be hidden. It would be commemorated. A humiliation woven into ceremony because Captain James Corvin had not only bested her in combat, he had spared her. Had walked away without claiming victory, without roaring over her broken body, without demanding submission, and that more than anything burned like acid in her pride. Across the city, Corvin sat quietly in a diplomatic chamber high above the arena floor. The stone walls were cool, the carved symbols of Krylorian culture etched in long, looping spirals around him. Warriors came and went. Some watched him with narrowed eyes, others with something far more dangerous, curiosity. He had no interest in ceremony. He had made no speech. When the officials had asked him to remain until Aricia could formally acknowledge her defeat, he had only nodded once. He didn't require her bow, nor her apology. He hadn't crushed her for honor. He'd crushed her because she spat in the face of the one man who came to stop blood from being spilled. Still, he couldn't ignore the way they looked at him now. Not like a diplomat. Not like a human. They looked at him the way predators eye a new apex. The door to the chamber slid open and Councillor Drenvok entered, a tall, pale-scaled Krylorian with a long robe that brushed the stone with every step. His eyes, old and amber like cooled magma, studied James with no attempt at pleasantry. "She's demanded a rematch," Vok said. James didn't look up. "Of course she has. She will recover in 4 cycles. Her pride may take longer." "I didn't fight her pride," James replied calmly. "I fought her disrespect. Yet you won both." James leaned back in the carved chair. "What does the council want?" Vok clasped his clawed hands. "To offer you an honorary place among our elite, to name you Trial Blood, a title reserved for those who defeat a decorated warrior of the Flame Rings in public combat." James raised an eyebrow. "And what does that mean for Earth?" "It means the Krylorian Empire no longer views your people as prey." For the first time, James allowed himself a tight, subtle smile. "Then it was worth the bruise," he said. Behind Vok's shoulder, a messenger entered and whispered something sharp and short. The counselor nodded once, then turned back to James. "She's coming." James stood slowly. "Now? She insists. She can't speak, but she wishes to see you." James followed the envoy through winding stone halls, past murals depicting centuries of war and victories that now felt small. When they entered the recovery chamber, the air shifted. Aricia was standing, barely, her arm in a rigid sling, her body tense, one foot pressed forward as if she still expected a fight. James approached her, stopping a few paces away, her golden eyes locked on his, unblinking. She tapped her claw gently on the side of a datapad and typed a single word. "Why?" He read it. "Why didn't I finish you?" She nodded. He answered without hesitation. "Because you thought defeating me would prove humans are beneath you. If I humiliated you, I'd be no better." She stood motionless, unreadable. James added, "You spit in my face and called me slave, but I don't answer to you. I answer to the people I protect. My victory doesn't belong to me. It belongs to peace. He didn't stay to watch her reaction. He turned, nodded once to the physician at the doorway, and left. Behind him, Aricia stood still, datapad hanging in her hand, the word Y still glowing on the screen. Her hand trembled, but not with rage, with something unfamiliar. Respect. The city of Xandrilos, nestled in the cliffs of Zalara's northern range, rarely experienced storm clouds. Yet today, thunder rolled over the skyline. The arena, once again filled with thousands of chanting warriors, now displayed something unexpected. Not a duel, but a procession. The trial of Iron Flame had not ended in death, and that required a ceremonial reckoning. Not punishment, not revenge. A reckoning of roles. Aricia stood before the crowd, her wounds still healing, but her bearing returned. She was robed in ceremonial dark gold silk, an outfit not for warriors but for ambassadors. By Krylorian tradition, she had forfeited her right to rule the dueling circuit. She had requested instead to speak, through gesture, through message, through action. At the center of the arena, Captain Corvin stood again. Not in battle gear this time, but in a formal Federation jacket, polished and dark, his hands behind his back. The crowd watched, breath held in disbelief. Aricia approached him slowly, stopping at his feet. She bent, not low, not in defeat, but in acknowledgement. She placed the tip of her claw to the sand and drew the spiral of forgiveness, the old war sigil for an offered truce. Then she turned to the crowd. A banner was raised behind her, painted not with her house sigil, but with a fusion. Two symbols intertwined, the flame ring of her legacy and the earth insignia of peacekeeping. The crowd erupted, not in mockery, in astonishment. James nodded once to her as she returned to her place beside the council. It was not victory that changed their world. It was restraint. Outside, rain began to fall for the first time in nearly a decade, and for the first time in recorded Krylorian history, the water wasn't stained with blood. The rain fell heavier that night, washing the dust from Xandrilos's ancient stones, running in silver rivers down the steps of the Colosseum where blood had so often dried and darkened the earth. Inside the great hall of verdicts, the fire pits burned low and ceremonial drums thudded in a slow, heartbeat rhythm. Captain James Corvin sat at a long obsidian table, waiting, his reflection a broken shadow across the polished surface. He had been summoned here not for judgment, but for proposal. Aricia entered the hall accompanied by two elders draped in crimson robes, their faces hidden under wide hoods. She walked without limp, without hesitation, her steps measured, echoing off the marble. She wore the scars of her defeat like new medals, her scales duller from recovery, but her posture proud. Without preamble, she placed an ancient blade, a short, curved weapon with inscriptions older than any Federation colony, on the table between them. James met her golden eyes, calm and steady. One of the elders spoke first, voice gravelly with age. "You have broken the old cycle, human." Blood answered with restraint, fury met with reason. "It is a disruption we cannot ignore." The second elder continued. "Aricia of the Iron Scales has invoked an ancient right, one not seen in generations, the bond of equals." James blinked. He knew little of Krylorian inner traditions, but the phrase alone was heavy enough to still the room. Aricia took the blade with her good hand, flipped it expertly, and offered it to him handle first. The meaning was unmistakable, even without translation. Alliance, brotherhood, permanent trust, or something deeper. He didn't reach for the blade immediately. "What would this bond demand?" James asked, voice low. Aricia's fingers brushed against her datapad. She typed swiftly, then held it up for him to see. "It demands your honor to stand with mine, against all enemies, without retreat or betrayal, and mine stands for yours." James leaned back slightly, studying her. This was not an offer made lightly. It was not politics, it was a blood vow. Among Krylorians, a bond of equals was older than treaties, older than kings. It was the sort of bond warriors made after surviving death together, or, in rare cases, after surviving themselves. He thought of Earth, of the endless bureaucracy that would never understand what was being asked here. He thought of the soft men in their suits, who sat comfortably behind negotiation tables and sent soldiers like him to die in dirt they'd never touch. He thought of Aricia, once arrogant, who had looked down on him and called him slave, and who now stood before him with naked pride and extended trust, asking for nothing less than everything. He took the blade. The hall exhaled in one great breath. The pact was made. Aricia smiled, not cruelly, not in victory, but with the slow, deliberate pride of someone who knew a new future had been carved in stone. The two warriors, once strangers defined by distrust, now stood on the same ground. Equal. Bound. The drums thundered once more, and outside lightning stitched the dark clouds with light. Peace, however, was never an easy garment to wear. Word of their bond spread across Krillorian space like wildfire, igniting old feuds and jealous ambitions. Not all factions welcomed the change. For every warrior who bowed in respect to the new order, there were 3 who whispered in taverns and plotted in crumbling strongholds about restoring the old ways. 3 days after the Bond of Equals was sealed, an assassination attempt was made. James and Aricia were walking along the Vareth cliffs, a sheer drop of violet stone above the crashing black seas. It had become a ritual between them, to walk in silence, to test the newness of their bond without ceremony. A soft buzz in the air warned James first, a vibration against his skin, too subtle for any untrained ear. He stiffened, slowing his pace. Aricia noticed at once, her hand drifting casually toward the blade strapped to her hip. The sniper bolt came from the cliffs above, silent and precise. James shoved Aricia hard to the ground, the bolt slicing through the air where her skull had been a heartbeat before. He rolled, drawing the concealed plasma knife from his belt, scanning the rocky ridge. Aricia was already moving, low and lethal, darting behind a cluster of stone, motioning with 2 fingers, flank left. James didn't hesitate. They moved like clockwork, like 2 dancers who had been practicing the steps for years, not days. No shouting, no wasted motion. Trust built not on words, but on instinct. The sniper tried to reposition, but James reached him first. The man, a lean Krylorian mercenary, barely raised his rifle before James slammed the hilt of his knife into his throat, collapsing his trachea. The mercenary gasped, dropped his weapon, and clawed at James's forearm. James caught his eye as he spoke, low and lethal. Wrong side of history. He finished it quickly. Aricia appeared beside him a moment later, blood spattered across her sleeve, her own attacker dispatched. They stood there, breathing hard, the sea roaring beneath them. For a long time, neither spoke. Finally, Aricia tapped her blade once against the stone, catching James's attention. She held up her datapad, her fingers moving quickly. They will not stop. James wiped the blood from his cheek and gave a tight smile. Neither will we. She smiled back, the fierce, raw grin of a warrior who had found something better than a throne, an equal worth bleeding beside. Lightning split the sky again, bathing them in harsh, brilliant white. The storm had come. But this time, they were ready for it. Together. The fire temple stood at the edge of the molten valleys, where the lava bled constantly through cracks in the earth like a wound that never closed. It was here that the ancient Krillorian warriors had once knelt in burning ash to prove themselves unbreakable. It was also here, many centuries ago, that the trial of fracture was born. A brutal, forbidden rite meant to test not skill or strategy, but the very soul of a warrior. It had been outlawed for centuries. No one dared invoke it anymore. Until now. James stood at the heart of the outer sanctum, surrounded by stone columns scorched black with history. The heat shimmered in the air, sweat already trickling down his back despite the thin combat tunic he wore. Before him, Aricia knelt in silence, her arms bare, her scales dry and rigid from ritual fasting. She had invoked the trial herself. Not out of pride, not for vengeance, but because the Krillorian High Circle had demanded she renounce her bond with a human, or face the rite of severance. Her choice had been simple: prove the bond stronger than fire, or be cast out by her own people. The trial would test not just her strength, but James's as well. They would enter the path of flame together. If one of them faltered, the bond would be declared impure, a lie, a mistake. The penalty for failure was death. As the gates opened and the firewalk began, James and Aricia moved side by side into the roaring crucible, the crowd of spectators shielded behind obsidian glass. Lava ran in slow veins beside the narrow bridge, smoke rising like spirits. The pain started quickly. The floor burned beneath their feet, the heat radiating up through their bones. James bit down on his breath, focusing on each step, matching her rhythm. Aricia did not speak, but her hands moved in steady signs between strides. Trust your pace. Feel the pattern beneath the heat. It's alive. James adjusted, shifting his weight, letting his feet land between the rhythmic pulses of heat, as if dancing to a song only the earth knew. Aricia bled from her hands, her palms having scraped jagged iron stones they were forced to climb midway through the walk. But she didn't stop. She didn't falter. Halfway across, a gust of fire exploded from a nearby vent, catching James across the side. His shoulders seared instantly. He staggered, dropping to one knee. The crowd gasped. Aricia turned at once, crouching beside him. Her face, so often a mask of steel, now bore panic, raw and silent. He met her eyes through the pain. "I'm not breaking," he hissed through clenched teeth. "I'm just learning how to rise slower." She helped him up, steadying him with her uninjured arm. They moved again, step by burning step. At the edge of the path, the final trial waited, the kneel of flame. They had to drop to their knees, palms flat on a searing platform, and remain until the inner circle approved the bond's truth. Aricia dropped first, unblinking, despite the hiss of her flesh against the heated stone. James followed, the agony immediate and absolute. They knelt there in silence, shaking, burning. And then the bell rang. The trial was complete. When the guards lifted them from the stone, both were unconscious, flesh blistered, lips cracked from the heat, but their hands were still touching. The high circle passed its judgment at sunrise. The bond stood. Not because they endured the pain, but because neither had let go of the other. General Vrax arrived in orbit 3 days later. He had been absent during the bond trial, fighting in the outer territories, but his return was not unexpected. Vrax was Aricia's former mentor, a decorated war hero, and one of the last great warmongers of the old ways. He had trained her when she was still crawling through the blood pits of Krylor's harshest academies. He had given her her first blade, and now he came to take it back. Aricia met him in the open plains outside the Flame Temple, the wind howling between them like a challenge unspoken. She wore no armor, only her scars and the heat-tempered brand of the bond of equals still etched red-hot into her left shoulder. James stood beside her, his own shoulder bandaged from the trial, but his eyes sharp. Vrax stepped down from his ship with a cloak made from the scaled hides of ancient battle beasts and a gaze that dismissed James as if he were a stone in the road. "I heard my student bent knee to a soft blood," he growled, voice like cracked rock. "No," Aricia said, her voice back in full strength, though hoarse. "I stood with an equal." Vrax narrowed his eyes. "And this equal, he would die for you?" "I would live for her," James replied before she could speak. "Harder to do, longer to prove." That silenced Vrax for a moment. His massive frame shifted. He stepped closer. "I taught you strength," he told Aricia. "You were born of fire. You chose to burn beside water. I chose someone who doesn't see me as a weapon." "You disappoint me," the general said flatly. "Then you taught me well," Aricia said, "because I was never yours to command." Vrax's claws twitched, his body coiling. "Will you fight me then?" James stepped forward. "She doesn't need to," Vrax snarled. "And you think you can stop me, human?" James's face remained unchanged. "No, but I know how to end you." Vrax stared into him, hunting for the lie. He found none. The general stepped back. "You've both grown foolish," he said, "but you've also grown dangerous." He turned. "I'll be watching, and so will every elder who dreams of seeing this bond broken." Then he was gone. That night, in their shared quarters, Aricia sat on the edge of the bed, blade across her lap, eyes distant. "He'll come again," she said. James nodded. "Let him. You don't fear the old guard?" "I don't fear ghosts." Aricia turned to him, reaching out, her hand curled around his. "We're not just a bond anymore," she said softly. "We're the start of something bigger." And outside, lightning again split the sky, no longer signaling war, but the storm of change, rising like fire beneath stone. By the time the second sun rose over Zalara's crimson horizon, the city of Xandrilos had changed. Banners that once bore the single sigil of the iron scales were torn down. In their place, new banners rose, woven with two symbols entwined, the Earth Federation's starburst and the flame ring of Krylor's oldest warriors. It was not conquest. It was recognition, and it ignited the Empire in ways no war had managed to. Younger warriors flocked to the new standard. Traders, healers, scholars, those long silent under the heavy thumb of the old traditions began to whisper of a future that didn't worship bloodshed. It wasn't peace. Not yet. But it was something they had never dared dream. Balance. At the heart of it all stood Captain James Corvin and Aricia of the Iron Scales. No longer simply bonded by right, but now recognized by the Flame Council as the first formal dual sovereigns, a title thought myth until now. They would rule together, not by decree, but by example. Unity of two bloods, two worlds, two stubborn hearts that refused to bend to history. But the Old Guard would not yield easily. General Vrax gathered the warbands in the shadow of the Koroth Range. Outnumbered and furious, they declared open rebellion against the Council's decision. They called James a defiler. They called Aricia a traitor. They promised to wash the valley clean with fire. James prepared the defenses without ceremony. He and Aricia stood side by side atop the bastion wall, the city's few defenders drilling below them. Farmers with sharpened tools, scholars wielding blades heavier than books. It was not an army. It was a people, defending their right to exist. Aricia stood silent, arms crossed, her golden eyes scanning the hills beyond. She could feel Vrax's hatred long before she saw his banners in the distance. "You still have time to run, you know," she said dryly. James chuckled, adjusting the plasma carbine slung over his back. "Left Earth for a war I didn't believe in. Stayed here for one I do." She glanced at him sideways, a rare softness flickering in her gaze. "If we die," she began. "We die standing," he finished. "Together." The horns of the old legion sounded across the valley. Dust rose, obscuring the horizon like a crawling plague. The battle was coming. James turned to her, reaching out. She gripped his hand hard enough that pain shot up his arm. He smiled through it. "Time to remind them," he said, "what happens when you corner fire and steel." Aricia's lips curved in a fierce smile. "They burn," she said, and the storm broke over them. The battle was not beautiful. It was raw, furious, and personal. Vrax led the first wave himself, thundering into the lower gates with a cry that cracked stone. His warriors, armored in the blackened scales of ancient beasts, fought with a desperation born of dying traditions. James and Aricia moved like twin blades, he with disciplined precision, she with savage grace. Where one faltered, the other struck. Where one bled, the other shielded. The city fought not with superiority, but with stubbornness. Farmers held bridges against trained killers. Children carried water and arrows to the walls. Elders threw oil and fire from the balconies. Every soul in Xandrilos fought, not for conquest, but for their right to choose who they would become. In the heart of the chaos, James found Vrax. The old general fought like a storm, unstoppable, brutal. His strikes sent defenders flying like leaves before a hurricane. He was the nightmare of a bygone era, tearing through the future with his bare hands. But James didn't meet him with rage. He met him with stillness. Vrax swung, and James dodged. Vrax bellowed, and James ducked. He wasn't faster. He wasn't stronger. He was smarter. The duel raged through the broken plaza, across shattered statues and burning banners. Then, at the moment Vrax overextended, his blade whistling past empty air, James drove the butt of his rifle into the general's knee. The old warrior staggered. In a blink, James pivoted behind him, locked his arm around Vrax's thick throat, and wrenched backward. The fall shook the ground. Vrax struggled, roaring, but James held tight. "Your time is over," James hissed into his ear. Aricia appeared beside them, bloodied but unbroken. She knelt, pressing the edge of her blade lightly against Vrax's exposed throat. It was not vengeance in her eyes. It was judgment. "You taught me strength," she said coldly, "but you never taught me mercy. I learned that on my own." And she rose. She left him breathing, broken, defeated. When the old general was dragged away by the council's guards, the field went silent. Across the city, the rebels dropped their weapons. The war was over. The night that followed was not filled with celebration, but something quieter, something deeper. People gathered around fires, sharing bread and water, patching wounds, burying their dead. And above them, the twin moons of Zalara hung bright and unblinking, bearing silent witness to the birth of a new age. James and Aricia stood at the edge of the cliff where it had all begun, the ruins of the old world behind them and the endless stars ahead. She took his hand without a word. He squeezed it once, and in that simple, stubborn grip, stronger than any oath, older than any flag, they promised themselves to the future they had fought for. A future where no one, ever again, would dare call the other slave.